Hello everyone, my name is Michael Baier, and on behalf of my co-authors, allow me to welcome you to our presentation covering our work entitled The High-Speed Multi-spectral Imaging of the Hypergolic Ignition of Ammonia Borane. To offer some brief background for those who might be unfamiliar, hypergolic propellants are a class of propellants characterized by their unique capability to self-ignite on contact between the fuel and oxidizer. This is illustrated in the image sequence shown here, where a single droplet of white fuming nitric acid, one of the more commonly used hypergolic oxidizers, impacts a small amount of fuel powder, with ignition occurring within a couple of milliseconds of contact. For most systems actively fueling these propellants, most use fuels based on hydrazine and other derived materials, such as monomethylhydrazine, unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, and so on. While these fuels have been well characterized and are the tried and true workhorse fuels for these systems, unfortunately they are quite hazardous in nature and in some cases carcinogenic. As such, there remains a strong motivation to develop alternatives that are less hazardous while still maintaining or improving the performance of these systems. Unfortunately, the complexity of the chemical kinetics driving the hypergolic ignition process make it difficult to distinguish between a well-performing hypergolic fuel and a poor one based simply on the chemical and physical properties of these materials alone. Nevertheless, there remains significant motivation to develop safer alternatives to these more toxic fuels, and in general, better understand the processes that govern the overall hypergolic ignition process to help inform future fuel formulation efforts. One such novel fuel receiving increased attention in recent years is ammonia borane, the simplest material in the broader amine borane family of fuels. Ammonia borane has been studied extensively in the past as a potential solid-state hydrogen storage medium due to its relative stability and high hydrogen density. What makes this fuel particularly interesting for propulsion applications, however, is that when tested with white fuming nitric acid, sub-millisecond ignition delays have been reported in some cases. The hypergolic nature of this fuel is demonstrated in the video shown here, where a single droplet of reagent-grade nitric acid impacts a small amount of loose ammonia borane powder, resulting in a brilliant green flame associated with the boron combustion. In addition, when one considers the theoretical performance of this fuel compared to other more conventional hypergolic fuels, a net increase in specific impulse is possible across a wide range of operating conditions, as shown on the plot here for these fuels with white fuming nitric acid. As ammonia borane, as I said, is the simplest fuel in this broader amine borane family of fuels, many of which are also similarly hypergolic, better understanding the behavior of this simpler fuel with regards to its hypergolic ignition behavior could help to offer better insights into the hypergolic ignition behavior of this broader family of fuels in general. Moving now into the focus of the present work, I'd like to offer some brief background into the diagnostic technique known as spectral imaging for those who aren't familiar with it. This technique relies on the idea that any given chemical species, depending on the types of chemical bonds present as well as the overall structure of the molecule, will have certain characteristic emission and absorbance bands associated with it. For situations where these bands are relatively discrete in nature, in the sense that there's little overlap between bands corresponding to different species, the emission bands from a given species can be selectively isolated and imaged as simply as using a optical bandpass filter and an appropriate visible or infrared camera. This technique has been used primarily in the past to study general hydrocarbon combustion, with some examples of candidate emission bands for some species relevant to hydrocarbon combustion being shown by the colored rectangles in the plot shown on this slide here. One example of this technique being demonstrated is shown here, where the authors of this particular work were interested in studying the evolution of various hydrocarbon species in a single cylinder of an optically accessible internal combustion engine as a function of the crankshaft angle for the engine, or more generally, this could be considered as a function of time. As the title of this work implies, the primary objective of this work was to adapt this spectral imaging technique to better study the hypergolic ignition process of ammonia borane, as well as in general obtain a better idea of the overall combustion behavior of this novel fuel. Given the fact that ammonia borane does not contain any carbon, within the molecule itself that is, we chose to focus our attention instead on species that are more relevant to boron combustion. Prior studies of boron combustion have resulted in a wealth of information regarding the emission bands of some of the assorted boron oxides that could potentially be used for this work, Some of these boron oxides, as well as the characteristic emission bands that have been reported for them, are reported in the table here. To better identify any candidate species for using this technique, we first obtained some basic emission spectra in both the visible and select infrared ranges produced by ammonia boranes simply burning in the ambient air. This was achieved using an Ocean Optics USB 2000 spectrometer for the visible measurements, as shown in the plot on the left-hand side of this slide, as well as a Andor Shamrock imaging spectrograph coupled to a Telops Fast IR 2K camera for performing the infrared measurements, with an example shown on the right-hand side of this slide. The visible emission spectra is characterized by these rather prominent emission features, most of which correspond to emissions previously reported for BO2. Some weaker emission bands were also observed at the shorter wavelengths, both of which have been reported as potential BO emission bands. In the infrared, we chose to focus primarily on the spectral band corresponding to emissions previously reported for HBO2, given its relevance in boron combustion, as well as the emissions previously reported for the BH stretch mode of ammonia borane and its assorted decomposition products, though these results aren't shown on this slide here. From the infrared-based measurements, we see that the emission-based measurements for HBO2 were in good agreement with previously reported absorbance measurements that have been published elsewhere, suggesting that the emissions that we see in this band are primarily due to HBO2. Shown in the figure here is the actual experimental configuration that was used during the spectral imaging work, with a list of the major species of interest that were chosen, as well as the corresponding bandpass filters used to selectively image the emissions from these species, shown in the table at the bottom left-hand corner of this slide here. The actual imaging of these species was achieved using a Telops Fast IR 2K mid-infrared camera for the infrared active species, specifically HBO2 and the BH stretch mode emissions of ammonia borane and any assorted fuel decomposition products that also contain BH bonds. Likewise, the visible active species, specifically BO and BO2 in this case, were imaged using a monochrome V2012 phantom camera. A third V5.1 color phantom was used unfiltered to provide a general visible reference of the overall combustion phenomena occurring for the two other filtered cameras. For performing the actual hypergolic ignition of ammonia borane, individual droplets of reagent-grade nitric acid were dispensed from a 100 microliter gas-tight syringe positioned roughly 7.62 centimeters above the surface of pressed ammonia borane fuel pellets. A Heine laser was used in combination with a photoresistor to both temporally synchronize the three cameras as well as trigger them when the oxidizer droplet was approximately 4 centimeters above the surface of the fuel pellet. So for the sake of time, I will be presenting primarily the more prominent results that were observed during this study. For those who wish to see this technique used in more detail, a supplemental video is available online accompanying the online version of this paper. Looking first at the initial pre-ignition phase, particularly in the spectral band associated with HBO2, we see some initial gray body emissions emanating from the fuel surface due to the heat initially released by the preliminary reactions between the ammonia borane and the nitric acid droplet. This is then followed by a gas evolution stage where we see diffuse HBO2 emissions throughout the cloud of gas that is released at this stage. As ignition has yet to occur at this point, this suggests that HBO2 for this particular system forms fairly rapidly, even at the lower pre-ignition temperatures that are present here. Additionally, the heat that is released through the formation of HBO2 at the AB nitric acid interface may also be one of the major driving factors behind the initial thermal runaway that eventually leads to ignition, and that also helps to further decompose the fuel and oxidizer, further supporting the eventual ignition and combustion of these materials. Once ignition has occurred, the flame rapidly propagates upwards, resulting in a relatively intense, though somewhat short-lived flame extending several centimeters beyond the fuel surface. Shown here in these image sequences are the relative emissions obtained simultaneously for BO2 and HBO2 in the left-hand side image sequence, as well as BO and the BH stretch mode emissions of ammonia borane and any assorted fuel decomposition products in the right-hand side image sequence. During this phase, the BO and BO2 emissions are relatively diffuse throughout the flame, with the strongest emission intensities being present within the propagating flame front. While the HBO2 emissions initially precede the visible flame emissions, as also seen on the previous slide, once the flame begins propagating, the location of the peak HBO2 emissions appear to lag behind that of the BO2 emissions, with the peak HBO2 emissions occurring more so within the inner regions of the flame. We don't gain too much new information from the ammonia borane and other fuel decomposition product-based emissions during this phase, other than the fact that they're fairly diffuse throughout the inner regions of the flame and that they rapidly drop off within the propagating flame front, as one would expect, since this is primarily where these are being consumed more readily. Once the nitric acid droplets have been fully consumed and the fuel pellets begin burning with the ambient air, a relatively stable diffusion flame would typically form at this stage, as shown in the image on the right-hand side of this slide here. Considering the emission intensities of the various species as a function of height above the fuel surface, results in the emission intensity profiles as shown on the plot on the left-hand side of the figure here. As one would expect, the ammonia borane and assorted fuel decomposition product-based emissions were strongest at the surface of the fuel, after which they gradually dropped off as we move higher and higher above the fuel surface. As with the previous flame propagation stage, the HBO2-based emissions appear to be strongest within the inner region of the flame, after which they gradually drop off as we move across the flame front. Now, following basic diffusion flame theory, one would expect the peak flame temperatures for a diffusion-controlled system specifically to occur at the location of the flame front, which in this case happens to coincide with the location of the peak BO2 emissions. Earlier studies of boron combustion have suggested that HBO2 is a relatively stable species, in the sense that after forming, it typically won't be consumed to form other more fully oxidized species such as B2O3, and in the process preventing the full energy release potential for boron-based fuels. The results shown here seem to contradict this idea, as if the HBO2 was truly stable in the sense that the concentration of HBO2 does not decrease over time, one would expect the emission intensity to increase as we move across the flame front, due to the fact that the emission intensity is impacted both by the concentration as well as temperature. This may suggest that for this particular system at least, the HBO2 that is formed initially is actually being consumed to form BO2 and other boron oxides, though further studies of the overall temperature profile within this flame would be necessary to confirm this further. In conclusion, despite the relative simplicity and overall qualitative nature of this technique, the spectral imaging technique discussed here was used successfully to study the complex hypergolic ignition process of ammonia borane, as well as obtain some general insights into the overall combustion behavior of this relatively novel fuel. HBO2 emissions observed during the initial pre-ignition phase suggest that even at the lower pre-ignition temperatures, the ammonia borane is being readily oxidized to form HBO2 even before any ignition has occurred. The heat released by this initial formation of HBO2 may be one of the major drivers of the further fuel and oxidizer decomposition, as well as the thermal runaway that eventually helps promote the ignition of the fuel and oxidizer. Additionally, the results obtained with this technique potentially indicate that, for this particular system at least, the HBO2 that is formed earlier in the combustion process may be being consumed more effectively to form BO2 and other more fully oxidized boron oxides. Further studies of the overall flame temperature profile and the other boron oxides not considered in this work here are necessary to confirm this idea, however. Listed here are a number of the different references that were used in putting together this work. And with that, I'd like to thank the various organizations that helped sponsor this work, namely the Army Research Office, the National Science Foundation, and finally the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. At this time, I'd like to thank you all again for attending this talk and open the floor to any questions that the audience might have. Thank you all again for attending.